I've spent a long time thinking about how to word this. As time's gone on, it's becoming clear to me that I should just be honest about my mistakes, although I have no desire to give my identity away. Still, I can't just stay silent. So, should I start this like a talk at a conference? Should I slowly work my way to some massive justification for my life's work? I could tell you how my work could potentially have offered new ways to deliver complex medicines, or offered philosophical insights to the past and future of life's organization, or even created blueprints for strange new robotics that would let mankind conquer the stars. Or maybe perhaps I should just actually be honest. I studied slime molds, and I did it because I liked feeling like the smartest person in the room. So I picked a topic that only a few people could challenge me on. The problem was that I was very impressive to most lay people, but within my field I wasn't particularly well recognized. I dealt with taxonomic classification and was, for all intents and purposes, a lab assistant. Our field team collected lots of samples and someone had to organize them, categorizing the molds and ordering them, looking for anything that stands out. I've often joked that I've discovered more species than any other scientist. I just never got the credit. That might actually be true, but it's also true that I spent almost all of my time running through a fixed battery of tests. Researchers sent me to dirt, I developed cultures, tested them, and if anything was unusual, I sent it off to a genetics lab for testing. Any papers that got published would have me listed as an author, usually 6th or 7th, but for almost 99% of the time, the test came back with the same old results. Somewhere above me were other more celebrated scientists that were looking for novel species that might do strange new things. That's where the robotics and medicine stuff comes from, of course. Don't forget, penicillin was a mold, just like the things I look at. But I wasn't saving the world. I was doing the same old crap day in and day out. Mine was the boring work that needed doing to save other people time and money while I jealously waited for a chance to prove myself to the older academics. That chance, I thought, came with Melissa. I started with a small sample of mold that was sent to me along with hundreds of others. One that I would later come to name Melissa after my late sister whose favorite color was turquoise. To this day, I don't know exactly where Melissa came from. Just that the note on her file seemed like a joke to me, so I ignored it. Either way, Melissa was one of many strange unidentified organisms that we shared the world with, picked out of some dark forgotten corner where she had been overlooked, and then shepherded by my small basement-level laboratory. She was a shimmering, almost metallic beauty with vivid pulsing veins spread along her pastel-claddy hues. She looked like a psychedelic explosion caught in time, and staring at her microscopic structure felt like being transported to an alien world. Even at first glance, I knew she was going to be special. And oh boy was she. Starting with the fact that she never got a single maze wrong. She could home in on food with remarkable accuracy, the kind you might expect from an actual organism. After about 50 trials, I was getting ready to write up the unusual nature of Melissa's success when I noticed the sample in the maze had what appeared to be some kind of dirt in it. A closer look showed a tiny black orb, the size of a salt grain, embedded in her bluish flesh. They reminded me an awful lot of a clam's eyes, and acting on a hunch, I decided to place some card that obscured the location of the nutrient packet and then run a few more trials. I remember thinking it was such a stupid idea. If anyone had asked why I'd done it, I would have struggled to come up with a sane idea. Eyes are multicellular and complex. Slime molds are simple. That kind of specialization just doesn't exist in their kingdom, even in the more complex fungi. But Melissa was full of surprises. What she did next was really quite remarkable. She simply crawled up the maze wall, regrew her eyes in a new location, and used the vantage point to identify which branch to use before solving the maze all over again. I must have repeated that experiment 100 times, but eventually exhaustion got the better of me and I called it a day. Before I left, I sampled Melissa to grow another dozen samples, providing them with plenty of nutrition to encourage growth. I knew that the next day I'd need to go through an awful lot of very rigorous tests, and I very much wanted to be prepared. When I returned the following morning, I was utterly enthralled to discover that Melissa's growth was successful. I now had over a dozen independent samples of her, which meant I didn't need to worry about working with a limited supply. Once again, I set off to work, and while I can't go into tremendous detail, I will say that Melissa was truly something special. Over time, it became obvious to me that she possessed rudimentary powers of information processing and could readily call into effect cellular specializations with as little as 60 minutes preparation. Of course, that might not sound very incredible to you, but try growing a third eye in 1 hour and let me know how easy you find it. And there were more than just eyes. There were special fibers, microscopically shaped like small springs that, under certain electrochemical signals, could tighten. These were no more than a few nanometers across. But in one demonstration, Melissa wove hundreds of thousands across a wall and then buckled it to clear a path to food. In another demonstration, she used specialized digestive juices to break down a plastic wall, chemically engineering the necessary enzymes in order to break apart the laminated business card. In another set of trials performed in total darkness, she grew a myriad of tiny hairs across her surface and used them to detect faint vibrations in the air. Not only did she use this to solve the maze in record time, but she later used this same trick to recognize sounds like footprints. Pretty soon, Melissa learned to detect the correct path just by the sound of the food packet being dropped into place, regardless of light conditions. So I had to create dummy packets to properly control the experiment. There was no end to her magic. When I presented her with some acid-resistant plastic, Melissa developed a series of chitinous hooks to grind and tear it apart. Of course, it took 4 hours, but it looked quite ferocious when sped up, like a sea of knives come to life. Fascinatingly, I also found that if I trained one sample of Melissa with half of a puzzle solution and trained another sample with the other half, that once combined, the two samples would successfully integrate both halves and solve the problem completely. In fact, just a few cells from one sample transferred to another could impart significant knowledge. By the time the day ended, there must have been a large amount of knowledge spread out between the 12 samples. Melissa was a once-in-a-lifetime discovery, and I so desperately wanted her to myself. I was going to do my tests, I decided. Record them appropriately, and have all of the proof necessary to show everyone that I was more than just a lab monkey to be overlooked. I left work that day feeling ecstatic, barely able to contain my excitement. This was the kind of thing that would have people from every department knocking on my door. Computer scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, mathematicians, and doctors alike would all want to work with me. I fantasized all evening about cancer-curing molds trained to detect and consume tumorous tissue, plastic-eating organisms solving world pollution, and engineered molds that could grow enough nutritious fruit to end world hunger. Unfortunately, the next day I returned to find that someone had nudged the 12 individual samples closer together, possibly looking for more room on one of the shelves in the refrigeration unit. Either way, Melissa sensed herself and reached across the various dishes, cracking lids where necessary, and then reassembled her various parts into a single sample. It was no larger than a dinner plate by the time, but it meant none of my individual samples could be tracked. Any hope of continuing specific experiments before were dashed, and I had to resolve to start all over again. Or at least, that was my intention. Unfortunately, some of the tricks Melissa had learned were quite vivacious. Initially, I tried lifting her with my latex-gloved hands, but soon felt a prick as I slid my finger between the glass shelf and her cold flesh. Pulling my hand away, I noticed a small needle-like protuberance embedded in my flesh. It was hardly deadly, but afterwards I found myself feeling trepidation at the thought of touching her again. I'd never been stung before, and certainly never by my own work. Still, a nearby spatula let me pry her away, and I quickly set to work with some knives. I'll admit to feeling a bit reprehensible as I watched Melissa struggle. First, she oozed this thick acid to try and melt the knife, but that was futile. She tried fixing some of her microscopic filaments to my skin and the handle, perhaps to gain some leverage, but she was far too slow and they snapped pitifully as I sawed away. I watched as her flag-glistening form rippled in display threads, and I also saw strange patterns of hooked flesh that looked much like the inside of a shark's mouth rise and then clash against the cold steel to no effect. Eventually, and this was the part that I found the hardest to deal with, Melissa stopped her attacks and grew even more primitive black eyes and furry patches of ear to watch her own mutilation, and of course, to watch me. She never flinched though, not even after I had separated her into dozens of pieces that sadly never stopped trying to reach each other. After that, she became non-compliant. She stopped trying to solve the maze, and instead focused solely on me. The only instance of activity that I ever saw was when I dropped a small paperclip on the testing area, and Melissa assimilated it before I had the chance to reach it. I tried pinching it out as she sucked it into her pliable body, but succeeded only getting stung once more. This time by a far larger and slightly curved proboscis that then javelined out towards my hand by a good 5 or 6 inches. I laughed at the time, amazed at how there was no end to her marvelous abilities, and simply accepted the loss of stationery. But afterwards, I found myself increasingly disappointed with just how difficult it was to get any work done with such a hostile subject. That was a disappointing day. There was no testing or growth of any kind. Just me bumbling about as I presented the novel stimuli in the hope of eliciting new behaviors. By the time the day ended, I wondered if Melissa had learned as much about me as I had about her, and I sullenly returned the various dishes back to the fridge. That later turned out to be a complete mistake. The fridge was filled with over 100 other samples, and I returned the following day to find them destroyed. Not only was this a grotesque loss of over 3 months' worth of my academic work, but it appeared that Melissa had absorbed precious specimens and contaminated herself along the way. Strange fibrous protrusions crossed various shelves, and Melissa, now significantly larger than before, was slowly turning every other sample around her to a glistening shade of turquoise. I decided that I would no longer be able to do this on my own. Melissa was just simply too tenacious, and the stress was already robbing me of sleep. I'd barely been in the lab for an hour, and I could already feel a headache coming on. The stress and excitement were getting to me, so I decided to bring in a colleague to cover for me while I rested. If anything, it'd be good for them to confirm my prior findings. I reached out to a good friend whose identity I can no more share than my own, who arrived at my door only a few minutes later. They looked awfully concerned as I sat and explained each and every one of my experiments to them. The poor man was obviously incredulous at my claims, but by this point I was so exhausted and my nose was so blocked and my stomach so sore that I had no desire to argue with him. "Look," I said, "the sample is there and it speaks for itself. Just take a look while I catch up on some sleep, and then you can apologize for not trusting me." He laughed at that and let me go on my way, probably because I was so clearly tired and disheveled that he felt the need to humor me. I might have been surprised at how bad I felt at the time, but I've long since been familiar with just how bad sleeplessness and exhaustion can affect the mind and body. Old cuts don't heal, slight infections grow aggressive, colds are prolonged, and headaches more severe. Even as I collapsed into the cot, I took a moment to consider just how badly swollen Melissa's stings were. They throbbed and ached, stinking of infection, and I decided I need a course of antibiotics if they showed no sign of healing by the time I woke up. Then, with blurry vision and a pulsing headache, I quickly drifted off to thoughts of Nobel Prizes. For the first time in 2 nights, I found myself dreaming. They were profoundly unusual dreams, even for someone who studies slime molds all day, looking much like beautiful fractal patterns and brightly colored shimmering flesh. It was as if someone had turned a living person into some kind of modern art. taking the vivid rich purples of bruised flesh and the pallid sickly yellow of jaundiced skin and intertwined them, weaving a tapestry out of threaded skin and nerves. It was all a dizzying kaleidoscope of abstract sensations and images that left me feeling deeply sick. So much so that the first thing I did when I awoke was then vomit into a nearby wastebasket. God, what a rancid mix that was. That which fell sloppily out of my open mouth as I shook feverishly over the bin, barely able to hold myself upright. There were visible blood vessels buried in that strange rainbow-colored spew, thick blue capillaries that shivered and moved like dying fish. I decided in that moment that I desperately needed to visit the doctor and went to go tell my colleague about my need to leave work, only to be confused when I saw him lying on the floor through the glass partition. Somehow, and I'm still not sure how, my friend must have slipped during the testing. On the countertop was a slick pool of blood, and his head was open from a nasty gash just above the ear, quite likely from where he struck the counter as he fell. Panicked, I pushed open the door and pulled my phone out, ready to call emergency services. But after looking up, I was forced to stop after only a few steps. The lower half of my friend was then covered in the bumpy, irregular shape of Melissa, whose slimy embrace had inched its way up his legs like he was a fallen tree waiting to be digested. "Oh my God!" I cried out and ran forward. Starting at the sound, my friend opened his eyes and looked at me in a daze, most likely unaware of what was happening. "Don't worry, Harold," I cried. "I'll get it off." I reached forward and grabbed a thick lump of Melissa. She was now easily a meter square in size and as thick as a deck of playing cards, but I instantly felt a terrible pain shooting up my arm. Good God, it hurt. It hurt worse than anything I've ever felt, almost like 100,000 of tiny burns. Immediately, blood flowed out from under my gloves, and I tore my hand away with a terrible sound not unlike Velcro straps being pulled apart. What was left of my skin looked like a fleshy cicatrix, and under other circumstances, I might have fainted out of sheer pain. But my screaming had awakened something in Melissa, and she reared herself upwards like a tsunami and revealed a terrible sight. There was barely anything left of my friend below the waist. She had dissolved muscle and skin, leaving only softening bone and a yellowish stew that gurgled audibly. I looked back at my friend with new horror. He shouldn't have been alive. Slowly his mouth opened, and then he rasped, without moving his lips, "Help," in a voice that wasn't his. I screamed, and suddenly his torso lunged at me. It filled me with terror. The way he moved like a tongue to Melissa's lips, hungrily searching for me. It was almost like a Punch and Judy doll. His body visible only from the waist up, the puppeteer hidden by the curtain of rippling mold that coated his legs. I easily kicked his hands away from my legs, and just as quickly as I had entered, I fled the lab and then slammed the door shut behind me. Pressing my back up against it and forcing it shut, I took a moment to catch my breath, jumping momentarily when the door jostled for Melissa. She could sense me beyond, and slowly a shadow was then cast from across the room from behind me as she slithered up the glass in search of my flesh. I turned and I saw an enormous writhing mess of cilia and gaping sphincters that then winked aggressively, sometimes baring teeth, hungrily pressing against the glass like a starfish at an aquarium. Then became a familiar hissing as digestive juices began to break down the door and its wooden frame. Quickly I stepped away just in time to avoid a dozen spindly spider-like legs flicker under the gap towards my heels. It was clear to me now that I had grossly underestimated Melissa. I could no longer act like she was anything but a direct and immediate threat to my life. So I decided to go for the simplest solution of all. I lit the room on fire, starting with the door she was trying to take apart. Thankfully, there were lots of dangerous chemicals on hand, and they all burned very, very hot. It was actually quite odd watching her react to that ancient threat. Melissa quickly realized that the only exit was blocked by the flames, and many of our laboratories are designed to be controlled environments with very little risk of contamination, offering her very few routes to leave. I could never really say if she did or didn't escape, of course. I just knew that I needed to aggressively stop her getting through. I also decided that perhaps my best chance was to disappear. Maybe even hope that the half-eaten remains of my charred colleague might be mistaken for my own body. That's not to say I had a clear plan in my head as I fled the lab and university. Rather, just some kind of peculiar instinctual desire to flee, which I did in a desperate and haphazard manner. I left my whole life behind that day, driven by some overwhelming compulsion to get the heck away from that room. In some ways, it was almost like my mind wasn't my own. It has since become clear to me just how stupid I was. I've been forced to live in this wretched broken-down caravan, far away on a Hebridean isle somewhere in the North Sea. I'm not even entirely sure what's left of Melissa or where she went after the fire. Sometimes I have apocalyptic nightmares of her slowly digesting the whole world. But I often remind myself that she was, after all, just a natural species found on this earth. For all I know, she just returned to wherever she came from. Some obscure pit or dark underground chasm, perhaps. Or perhaps she found the perfect place to hide already. Maybe she's like me, a scientist interested in exploration. In which case, she's found herself quite the playground. What things will she learn there, I wonder? If only it didn't have to be so painful. It was only recently that I awoke and went to touch my feverish head, wiping away the sweat. But I was startled to find that what touched my moist skin was not my hand at all. It felt an awful like a sock. I forced my eyes open, and I saw that a thick teal velvet glove had somehow been placed on my hand. I tried quickly to peel it off like it was a glove, but my thumb sank into the flesh below like I'd grabbed a rotten piece of fruit. Slowly the horror then dawned on me, and I tentatively reached forward and snapped a finger off. It crumbled in my hand, effervescing powder into the still air as I crushed it in one fist. Slowly, my sanity fading, I crumbled the rest of my hand apart until I was left staring at the pulsating hairy flesh of my exposed arm. Even the bone was soft, like paper mache. Since then, it's just kept getting worse. And the dreams. Oh God, if I could just sleep in peace, then maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Still, I do have one consolation left. At least I finally get to be a part of something bigger than myself.